Geek fans, welcome back. It's time for another in-depth review of Geeks at the Movies. This is where we bring you a little bit of film criticism and a history lesson all rolled into one. My name is Shane Goodrich. I'll be your host this evening, and joining me, as always, illustrious lead writer of Geeks at the Movies, Rachel McLeod.
Ahoy, meaties.
Today we are reviewing Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World, directed by Peter Weir and based on the famous series of historical novels by Patrick O'Brian. This stars Russell Crowe as Captain Jack Aubrey, Lucky Jack as they call him, and Paul Bettany as Dr. Stephen Martyrin. And this really is just a high-sea epic. You're placed on board the HMS Surprise in the Napoleonic Wars, and we're tracing down a French ship, a bigger French ship, and there's lots of sea battles, and there's sea songs, and there's all kinds of great awesomeness. They go to the Galapagos Islands at one point. It's just a wonderful adventure. Rachel, you're the one that picked this movie. Why did you do it?
I'm in the mood for high sea adventure, but mainly at Geeks in the Movies, we've been doing a lot of films like The Patriot and Glory that featured a lot of land warfare, infantry, and artillery. But let's look at how naval combat is portrayed in film, and this is one of the excellent illustrations of how it's done. So when I look at Master and Commander, I'm looking at how naval warfare takes place and how naval warfare is conducted. And this movie was an excellent illustration. Let's talk authenticity.
Oh man, this is a very authentic film. Right from the very beginning in the first battle, you can really see the authenticity. Let's just look at this clip just for a moment to see what I mean. I mean, as you can see right there, Rachel, it draws you right into the film. I mean, right from the start, you see this crazy sea battle. You don't really know what's going on. They're using all this lingual and terminology and technical terms. Like, I don't know what's happening, but it draws you right into that world. And they really nailed the authenticity. Yeah. I mean, this is a fictional story with fictional characters, but it's more authentic than some of the other historical movies we've actually have reviewed. It brings to life everyday events and details of the time period. Like, for example, you see teenagers, people that are 13 years old, they're actually officers commanding people in battle. It seems strange, but it's actually what happened during the time period because running one of these kinds of ships was very difficult. It required a lot of technical knowledge, so noblemen and people of wealth would put their younger sons into the Navy at a younger age to get a heads up, so they can really learn this stuff.
Sort of an apprenticeship, really.
Yes, really, yeah, exactly.
And never mind the fact that on a ship, we're talking about tight spaces, claustrophobic, and if you want to get involved in the seafaring life, you're gonna have to start very young because there's so much involved with the actual
navigation, running the ship,
rigging, sailing, repair work, carpentry, all of it. There's so many logistical things that need to be learned, and you can't learn later in life. You're gonna have to learn as early as possible. So you're gonna see some youth involved in the crew work. But yeah, from the first 30 minutes of this movie, we're seeing a lot. And the high tension, we see a lot of fog, we see a lot of mist, we see the challenges of navigation, we see the challenges of basically doing ship-to-ship repairs, ship-to-ship combat, then repairs.
On the sea. They don't go to port, they're doing it while they're out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, we can't go, we have to repair now or we're dead.
And that scene we just saw, we were also seeing the devastation that a ship can take just from the cannonballs. It's not the cannonballs per se that does the direct damage, but it's all that blistering shrapnel and all the damage and all the
tears all the rigging apart.
Right.
It's what actually causes most of the injuries and fatalities with the splinters.
And in terms of dealing with the fatalities and with the injuries, we see also in terms of authenticity the challenges of a doctor on ship who's trying to manage disease and these injuries and so forth and so on. That's authentic. I mean, you see
yes, the toolkit is very accurate, and it shows like he's below deck, right? He's below the line of the cannonball firing. So he's getting these people in this dark little dingy area. There's blood all over the floor. The ship is shaking back and forth and rolling. And you see the trouble, just being a doctor trying to save these men. This experience, it boggles my mind.
Right.
Like I imagine myself like living for months at a time on this ship. It's your only home. This is it. Everything is there. Everything that you want, but all the food, the supplies. It's a mind-boggling task, and they really show you the reality of it in Master Commander.
I think in some ways this movie shows you more of the horrors of war than maybe we've seen in Glory, where they kind of glossed over the injuries that you can possibly sustain in sea combat. Here we see the the injuries, we see the damage much more so. Granted, it may not be the R rating where we see blood and guts everywhere.
Yeah,
but we do see a bit more than Glory and obviously with
You
Patriot.
do, but there's still, again, I hate any war movie. I dislike it when they don't have the R rating because, for example, during the battle scenes, which are very good and well shot, you don't see much blood. You don't hear people screaming out. You don't actually see the gruesome damage, and you might go, well, do we really need to see all that? To really understand the warfare and how scary it was, I think you do need to see some of that. But this movie's more than just about naval combat.
Right.
It's about naval life.
Yes.
Everyday life. How do you run a ship? I mean, we see that there is like a kind of a family vibe going on. People start to know each other so well. But at the same time, you need to keep discipline in check. So it's very interesting seeing this tension between the officers and the men. There has to be a respect maintained, a boundary maintained. At one point, we see a young, an older midshipman, an officer, who is not really respected by the men. And it's really interesting to see that dynamic. How do you get the men to respect you, but not hate you? Because Captain Jack, he tells them, you don't have to be a tyrant, but you can't be friends with them either. There has to be, it's interesting.
A line of separation.
A line of separation. Like, how do you maintain discipline on this ship?
So on the one side, it's like, while we are a family, this is still a ship of war, and we have to maintain the chain of command. We still have to maintain military discipline. Now, with the relationship between the Doctor and Captain Jack, we see some tensions in there. It's like, well, how do you maintain the discipline? Shouldn't we all be friendly and whatever? Hey, look, I'm a captain. This is a warship. This is a ship of war. We're on a military mission. Discipline has to be maintained in a military fashion. We are a military ship.
Yes.
This isn't the Love Boat. This isn't this isn't a leisure cruise. We're on a mission here. So there is some tension between the Doctor and the Captain in regards when they have a discussion about how do we maintain discipline.
The only things that keep this little wooden world together are hard work, discipline.
Jack, the man failed to salute.
For God's sake, Stephen, there's hierarchies even in nature, as you've often said yourself.
There is no disdain in nature. There is no humiliation.
Men must be governed. Often not wisely, I will grant you, but they must be governed nonetheless.
And in general, I love the interactions between the Doctor, played by Paul Bettany, and Russell Crowe, plays Captain Jack. I love their interactions because it also informs the viewer about how does ship life really work. In his conversations with Captain Jack, we learn a bit about sea life. We learn a bit about how you need to maintain a chain of command. We also learn a key term, the weather gauge. This term is constantly used throughout the film, and for the most part, the terms aren't defined. They don't just tell you what the terms mean. You kind of have to get it. But with the weather gauge, it's very important that you understand this. And the weather gauge simply means the wind is in your favor for sailing. So it makes it so when you're in combat with another ship, you have a better ability to maneuver and fire than the other ship does. That's what the weather gauge means. And they use the Doctor as the kind of like, oh, he's the everyday man who doesn't know. It's stretching things a little bit because he's been on the ship for months. He almost certainly would know by now what the majority of naval terms mean, and he seems to be slightly too ignorant. But I get it. It's a good device for us that may not be naval experts.
Right, exactly. Now, another thing that I want to bring up now that I think about the movie is we've talked a little bit about the authenticity, but now we think about what sort of inspired some of this history that they've injected. And I noticed as I did some research that the HMS Surprise was basically inspired by the HMS Speedy, which was a 14-gun frigate ship that had a major battle under the Captain Lord Cochrane against a Spanish frigate known as the Gamma, which was a 32-gun ship with a 315-member crew.
Wow.
And I don't want to use the cliche, so I'm not. But in terms of in terms of this battle, it was really epic differences and disparities. And in some sense, this story is kind of mirroring some of that historical,
source material.
Yeah, source material. And in terms of the Acheron, the French frigate that the Surprise has to chase after, that's partially inspired by the USS Constitution. The
old Ironsides.
Right. And the hull, the composition of the hull with a sort of reinforced oak hull, that was taken from the USS Constitution in part, where you have live oak and white oak sandwiched together in a nice reinforced hull shape. And they made reference to that in the movie. I thought, oh, that's kind of clever, which also kind of leads to a bit of a flaw when they mention that the Acheron was built in the New England, which I think is kind of far-fetched for a French naval warship.
Yeah, so the novel this is based off of was set in the War of 1812, and it was the British fighting the Americans. So when they changed it to the Napoleonic Wars, they changed it to 1805, just to please, I guess, American audiences, Some of the details that came along with it don't make much sense anymore. So, for example, they changed the ship to a French ship, but it's still made in New England, and its design is suspiciously like the USS Constitution.
Right.
I can understand some of that. Also, some of the timeline involving Admiral Nelson, the famous admiral,
Right.
they mentioned him a few times in the movie. It doesn't necessarily quite add up. At one point, one of the younger officers is given a book from the captain about the adventures of Nelson, the great Horatio Nelson.
Right.
Except the book in real life came out a year after
Right.
Nelson's death at the Battle of Trafalgar. So there's a few weird things like that happen in the film. But overall, it's mostly very historically accurate. There's a couple other minor issues, again, because of the time change. Probably the dumb one, for me, the dumbest one, is at the end of the film, he sends one of his other officers, his second in command, off with the captured Acheron. He sends him to go to a Spanish port. But that makes no sense because during this time period, the Spanish and the French are allies.
Right.
So that doesn't make any sense. But these are all minor details.
Right.
And as you say, from the source material, like the battles, they're all inspired by other crazy and unusual events. I mean, there's all kinds of famous captains during this time period doing seemingly incredible things.
Right.
So here you get a taste of all of that, kind of condensed into a very short time period. Maybe it's a little bit busier than it should be, but it's a movie.
They capture
It's a
this.
movie.
They capture the spirit of the era,
Right.
and I think that's what they're really going
Yes.
for. They're capturing the spirit of the era. It's like we've got some inspiration from real historical events and real historical battle scenes and battles, condensed for the purposes of a 2-hour movie.
Right.
It had to.
This is
be
not a miniseries. We're
Right.
going to show a whole year of time.
Right. So I thought they captured the spirit of it, in terms of like the tactics and interesting things that Captain Jack does in order to win this battle with the Acheron. That's all very much authentic.
Yes.
The changing of flags, the disguising of the ship as a whaling ship. Those were all very much plausible tactics that were used in real life battles in the time period. So you got me there.
Using a
excellent.
decoy. At one point, he uses a decoy to lure the Acheron off. I mean, all these things are just examples that we actually saw in history. Again, it is condensed a bit. It's amazing how many times they managed to stumble upon each other in the vast Pacific. At one point, they're in the Pacific Ocean, and they're like, oh, they stumbled upon each other again. But you have to accept that for the sake of the story.
Right.
They don't have. It's not a movie that's going to show you 2 years time.
Right.
Or
This
something.
isn't going to be a reenactment. This is a story. This is a narrative.
Right, and it's really well done, and it brings to life the times in such a wonderful way. If you're interested in historical drama, if you're interested in naval warfare, or just the Navy, or just ship sailing, being a sailor, I recommend this movie. What, Rachel, would you give it for a review?
I give it a 5. It's an excellent illustration of naval combat in authenticity. Sure, there might be some shortcomings, but overall, I would totally show this in a history class
Yes,
or
I
in a
would.
lecture and say, this is naval warfare. This is Napoleonic naval warfare. This is what it's like to live on a ship. Here's what's, the day-to-day life and struggles of seafaring. And yeah, I totally recommend it.
And I mean, even more broadly, this kind of shows you the general tactics used just during the great age of sail. So even stretched out even farther from the Napoleonic period, you go back to the Revolutionary War period, the 7 Years' War. Things weren't that much different. The uniforms were
That's very true.
changed,
I mean,
but the actual habits in everyday life would have been exactly the same.
I mean, that's very true. Especially like if you look at the Revolutionary War, was seafaring that much different? No, not really.
No, it's very simple. The uniforms have been different. Everything else has been virtually the same. Okay, I'm also going to give this movie 5 out of 5 stars. It is a fantastic adventure on the high seas. Is there anything else you want to add, Rachel, before we end?
I'm good. Go see this movie now.
It's fantastic. So remember, this is In-Depth Reviews at Geeks the Movies, where we give you a little bit of film criticism and a history lesson all rolled into one.